You've probably seen the headlines: 600,000 lives suddenly hanging on a Supreme Court decision. But here's what almost nobody's saying out loud. This ruling isn't just about immigration law. It's a reset button on power. Because with one signature and a majority vote, the highest court in the land just handed the keys back to the executive branch. No lower court interference, no endless injunctions, just raw, direct authority. Now think about that for a second. For years, these temporary protections kept families working, paying taxes, and raising kids right here in the U.S. But with this ruling, that entire foundation just got shaken. Overnight, the system that's been running on extensions and exceptions could flip, depending entirely on who's sitting in the Oval Office. And that's the real story here. It's not only about 600,000 people who might lose status, it's about how fast presidential power can turn that number up or shut it down completely. So today, we're cutting through the noise and breaking it all down. What the Supreme Court really said, what happens next, and what this means for anyone living under TPS right now. Stay tuned, because once you understand how this decision plays out, you'll see why it's not just a headline, it's a turning point. Let's bring this out of the courtroom and into real life. Picture this: a mom in Los Angeles who's been working legally for 12 years under TPS. Her kids were born here, go to school here, speak English better than Spanish now. She's paid taxes every year, renewed her papers, followed every rule laid out by the Department of Homeland Security. Then, with one decision, everything she's built can disappear. Not because she did something wrong, but because the law that kept her safe just shifted back to the hands of whoever holds office next. Now multiply that by thousands. People from El Salvador, Haiti, Venezuela, Sudan, folks who've spent a decade building businesses, buying homes, and volunteering in their neighborhoods. They're not faces in a statistic. They're the ones fixing your cars, serving your coffee, caring for patients in local hospitals. And the scariest part? They don't even know what's next. Because the way the ruling is written, everything depends on a single word: discretion. Meaning, the president, not Congress, not the courts, decides who stays, who goes, and when the clock runs out. That's why this ruling hit harder than most people realize. It's not just law. It's lives, jobs, families, all balanced on a policy that can flip with one election cycle. Before we talk about what's changing, you need to know how this program even started. Temporary Protected Status, or TPS, was never designed to last forever. It came out of the Immigration Act of 1990, and the whole point was simple: give people a safe harbor when their home country got hit by war, natural disaster, or political collapse. 6 months here, maybe 18 months there, just enough time for things to stabilize before they could go back home. That was the plan on paper. But over the years, those temporary windows kept getting extended, administration after administration, until temporary started looking a lot like permanent. For many, this wasn't about waiting out a crisis anymore. It became the foundation of their entire life. Work permits, driver's licenses, mortgages, kids in American schools, all built on a program that was meant to expire. It's a system that turned into a paradox: stable enough to build a future, fragile enough to lose it overnight. And now, that fragile promise is exactly what the Supreme Court just put back under the spotlight. For years, the real fight over TPS wasn't in Washington. It was playing out quietly in a San Francisco courtroom. Judge Edward Chen became the name everyone in immigration law circles knew because he was the one keeping the program alive through injunctions and appeals. Every time a new administration tried to roll back TPS, lawsuits followed, and Chen's rulings put those terminations on hold. It wasn't about rewriting the law, it was about freezing time. The ACLU and immigrant rights groups argued that ending TPS would rip families apart without due process, and for a while, that argument held. The courts became a shield, a slow-moving buffer that kept people working while the political winds shifted back and forth in D.C., but that legal safety net had a price. It stretched the original intent of the law far beyond what Congress ever imagined. Each new extension built another layer of dependency, and when the Supreme Court finally took the case, that entire structure got tested. The justices weren't just looking at humanitarian impact, they were asking a harder question. Who actually has the power to decide when temporary ends? And that's where everything flipped. When the case reached the Supreme Court, the majority didn't waste words. They went straight to the constitutional core: separation of powers. Their message was clear: immigration policy is the responsibility of the executive branch, not the judiciary. In simple terms, the court said the president has the authority to end or extend TPS at will, and lower courts no longer get to play referee. For years, those injunctions acted like speed bumps, slowing every change in policy no matter who was in office. But now, those roadblocks are gone. The majority opinion argued that the statute was written to give flexibility to the executive, that Congress knew it was delegating that power, and if lawmakers had wanted limits, they would have written them in. It's a classic conservative interpretation: stick to the text, not the emotion. They called it a matter of structure, not sympathy. And while that might sound cold, it's the logic the court used to pull the plug on years of legal limbo. In their view, TPS was never meant to be a permanent safety net. It was meant to be temporary. And now, the Constitution is back to saying exactly that. Not everyone on the bench agreed. The dissent hit hard, warning that this ruling wasn't just a legal correction, it was a humanitarian time bomb. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, joined by Justices Kagan and Jackson, argued that the court had stripped away the only layer of protection standing between law-abiding families and deportation orders. They saw it as the judiciary walking away from its moral duty to review executive overreach. In their view, the decision didn't just hand power back to the president. It erased decades of precedent meant to keep that power in check. The dissent pointed to the human cost. Parents who've lived here longer than their own children have been alive, workers filling gaps in industries that rely on them, and kids who may soon be forced to choose between staying or leaving the only country they've ever known. But the majority's answer was simple. Congress writes the law, not emotion. And that divide between constitutional authority and human consequence is what will define how this ruling is remembered. The dissent saw chaos coming. The majority called it order restored. Only time will tell which side was right. Here's where it stops being theory and starts being reality. Right now, more than 600,000 people are living in the U.S. under TPS. Most of them are from places like El Salvador, Haiti, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, countries still dealing with economic collapse, political violence, or natural disasters that never really ended. Add it all up, and you're talking about nearly 1.2 million people when you count family members who depend on them. These aren't just numbers. These are taxpayers, essential workers, and parents raising U.S.-born kids. According to labor data, nearly a quarter of TPS holders work in critical industries: healthcare, construction, food services, the jobs that keep the country running quietly in the background. If that status suddenly disappears, it's not just lives disrupted, it's entire communities. Local economies lose workers overnight. Employers lose trained staff they can't easily replace. Schools lose students. Neighborhoods lose stability. That's why this ruling isn't some abstract courtroom headline. It's something that will ripple through small towns, big cities, and entire states. Whether you call it a correction or a crisis depends on where you stand. But either way, the shockwaves are already moving. So where do we go from here? There are really three ways this could play out. First, the executive branch could double down. The ruling gives the president full authority to decide who keeps protection and who doesn't. That means future administrations can either expand TPS or shut it off entirely. No questions asked. Every election from now on could reshape the map overnight. Second, Congress could step in, though that's a long shot. Lawmakers have talked for years about creating a permanent pathway for long-term TPS holders, but immigration bills die faster than they're written. Without bipartisan momentum, that door stays closed. And third, the humanitarian response. Cities, nonprofits, and employers might start pushing local policies to cushion the fallout. Temporary work permits, housing assistance, maybe even state-level protections. But all of that is patchwork, not permanence. The truth is, every path forward now depends on politics, not policy. And when the lives of over 1 million people hinge on election cycles instead of legislation, stability becomes a privilege, not a guarantee. At the end of the day, this decision isn't just about immigration. It's about power, policy, and people trying to hold on to the only life they've ever known. The Supreme Court just reminded everyone that temporary still means temporary. But it also reminded us how fragile stability can be when it depends on politics. For families under TPS, this is the moment to stay alert, stay informed, and make moves now. Update your paperwork, talk to an immigration attorney, and keep an eye on policy changes from the Department of Homeland Security. Because when laws shift this fast, silence is the enemy. What happens next will define not just who stays, but what kind of country we become in the process. Make sure you like, subscribe, and drop a comment down below. Stay sharp.